Hello everybody and welcome to NCC Group's Cyber Threat Intelligence monthly webinar. I'm Matt Hull, usual host, looking after proceedings today. What we've got coming up today, usual quick overview of our ransomware stats and trends, just to let everyone know what the picture looks like there in terms of ransomware. That's obviously looking at finalised details from May. The usual threat and vulnerability roundup. So just looking at some of the items that are flying around at the moment, I think is worth bringing to people's attention. Hopefully not too much of it is going to be a surprise to you because you'll all already be aware of it, which would be lovely. And then we've got a fantastic special guest, Dylan from our Cyber Threat Intel team is going to be doing a spotlight piece around some emerging criminal tooling called Katana. So that's actually a write-up that we've got in our monthly threat pulse this month, but Dylan's kindly agreed to come along and do a bit of a deeper dive for the session as well, which is great. Ransomware, what's going on? Number of ransomware victims that we've tracked has seen a slight decline month on month, so 4% reduction in the number of victims between now and April, or between May and April. But as you can see there, we are starting to see that, yes, 2026 is appearing to be a busier year once again in terms of the number of ransomware victims as we're carrying on. Normally tend to see a little bit of a dip at this point, but it seems to be fairly level. So we'll be interested to see what things get up to during the summer months as we get into them. Usual breakdown in terms of regional split. North America continues to be the most targeted of our regions. No real movement in terms of the top targeted sectors. That being said, consumer discretionary continues to edge its way towards first place. Again, sort of prime time of year, targeting the hospitality. We've seen a number of hotel chains and the like being targeted by various groups. And then in terms of the groups, Killing and the Gentlemen continue to be the front runners. The Gentlemen picking up pace in terms of their activity. So if possible, when it comes to any threat hunting activity, if you've got that availability within your environments, well worth taking a look at the known TTPs and IOCs of the Gentlemen and Killing to run those across your environment. I'm sure you'd already know about it if you've been compromised by one of those groups, but well worth having a look anyway. Ben, yeah, absolutely, Ben. So a couple of insurance firms and also consultancies, they actually sit within the industrials, within the GICS categorizations. Yes, in short, we are seeing targeting of that sector as well, in particular, and that sits within that top space. I'd love to be able to go into a bit more detail about breaking those down actually in a future session. So you've just prompted me to have a think about something for our next session in July. But yeah, thank you, Ben. First off, Fortinet. You've been under a rock, I think, if you haven't seen what's been going on with Fortinet this week. Not to diminish the work that everyone's doing, but Fortinet, big exposure here. Number of sets of credentials, so around 86,000 devices been compromised, and a whole set of credentials and various other PII have been exposed. Off the back of this, there are tools out there. So if you check out the UK NCSC or any of the NCSC websites, you'll be able to check whether your environment has potentially been compromised. Take some of it with a pinch of salt and do your sort of due diligence on any of the data that's within there. You'll see these tools now saying you may have been impacted by this particular breach. Verify it. So just publicly out there, there's a number of organisations that have reached out to us who've seen their details within this data set. We've actually got a copy of the full data set ourselves anyway. And we do the sort of the attribution on some of the IP ranges and things like that that have been listed, and they're not always coming back to the domains that are showing as the victim. So doesn't mean you're not in there, doesn't mean you are in there. Well worth just double checking when it comes to attribution of the data that's within the exposure. Info stealers, so some good reports coming out of Flashpoint, a big piece of research that they've done in terms of the number of info stealers. And absolutely to their point, it's definitely a case of logging in rather than breaking in at the moment. I've talked about this quite a few times. It's one of my strategic advisories for this year is that identity continues to be that frontline when it comes to organizations being compromised. The interesting thing around here, obviously, is that infosteers in particular have been a growing capability within a criminal toolkit, being able to identify credentials, cookies, authentication tokens, and so on and so forth. We continue to see this within our incident response world. Lots of compromises that are ultimately as a result of creds that have been exposed due to infostealer on a personal device, in some cases corporate devices that aren't MDM managed. Just in the case of the infostealer world, there's a few things that can be done. Obviously, MDM monitoring for exposed credentials continues to be really quite relevant and important at the moment, especially where devices are potentially being used for corporate services outside of the usual scope. We know as well that these stolen creds are being used by other groups. This isn't just a case of monetizing the stolen information, but the likes of shiny hunters continue to reuse stolen data from previous exposures for further breaches. Talked about a few times on these sessions, but the recruitment or fake recruitment activity that's leading to sort of insider threat situations has clearly been high in volume, or at least had potential high impact. We know that that's the case when Five Eyes put out a joint statement around Chinese military intelligence services setting out these fake recruitment campaigns. So the bulletin that came out, in fact, I'll make sure that there's a link that's shared with everyone with some advice on how to spot fake recruitment or fake applications. But it is clearly an issue, particularly if you operate within government, military, or financial services. By all accounts, these seem to be the organizations that are targeted, but also the report indicates that anyone with any particular clearances within these environments as well. So UK, for example, if you hold SC, more likely to be targeted if you operate within those spaces. Mini Shai Hulud, I talked about this last month. I think what I was telling everyone was that the source code had been released publicly. Guess what? Various new variants of Mini Shai Hulud had been created off the back of this. Miasma and Hades are two that are doing the rounds. What I can tell you is that a couple of days after we put out our threat pulse and where we talked about this, we started getting calls from a number of organizations. So we've been actively involved in incident response in relation to this. We've put out a report. Dylan, in fact, was responsible for writing the report, and the link in there is the write-up around the Mini Shai Hulud in particular. So well worth the read of that. We're going to be putting out some broader comms around it as well, and what to spot and how to recover in these situations. All being well, most people are getting a grip of it by now, but the fact that it is public source code now means that we are likely to see further compromises off the back of this. But well worth the read of that report, and I'll make sure everyone gets a copy. Threat alerts, so the vulnerabilities that we've raised for awareness over the last couple of weeks. I'm not going to go into great detail with this because I want to make sure that Dylan's got plenty of time to go through his session, but Avanti Sentry, a couple of vulnerabilities in there. These are proof of concept and not actually actively exploited in the wild, not that we're aware of yet. But two fairly highly critical vulnerabilities leading to remote code execution in both cases, and in both cases from an unauthenticated point of view as well. So if you have that in your environment, well worth double checking that you've patched those. The patches do fix these particular vulnerabilities. PeopleSoft, so Oracle's PeopleSoft has been, there's particular vulnerability, so 35273 of 2026. Has a vulnerability that's been leveraged quite readily by shiny hunters. So back end of May into the beginning of June, there was some known exploitation of that vulnerability by shiny hunters. Oracle actually put out a notification of that. So make sure that that is patched as well. Those patches are available. VLLM, so large language model API integration type platform, has vulnerability associated with it, allowing for unauthorized access to internal models, also some potential data exposure, and also some of the compute resources that sit behind the scenes of whatever models are in place. Quite relevant if you're leveraging AI within your environments and using this for API authentication. And that was it for me this month. Fair few bits going on, some big hitters. Mike, question from any updates or views on the MS Defender Rogue Planet 0 day? I've not got anything specifically that I can report on. Dylan, I don't know if that's come across your desk this week.
I briefly saw it, but I haven't done any research into it to give a really in-depth answer yet.
No, leave it with us, Mike. If there's something we can come back with, then we will do. It's not something that the team's been allocated yet, so let me have a look into it for us and see if there's anything we need to report on. If it is, it'll come out via a threat alert, so hopefully you'll already be getting those through anyway. So yes, that's it from me for the time being. I'm going to hand over to Dylan, who's going to do a fantastic walkthrough of Katana. Dylan, over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much, Matt. Just before going into it, I guess to give a little bit of a background on myself. My name's Dylan. I'm one of the tactical threat intelligence analysts here on the CTI team. So I'm focusing a lot on the technical components of CTI. So my bread and butter is tracking malicious adversary infrastructure. And this is how I actually discovered Katana. So just going straight into it, what is Katana? At its core, it's an adversary in the middle fraud platform. The term is used quite frequently, it's thrown around, so it's worth being precise about how it differentiates from other fraud platforms we've seen. So Katana doesn't redirect its victims to a conventional phishing page like others. Instead, it mirrors legitimate websites in real time, proxying the traffic from a victim's computer through to attacker-controlled infrastructure. So from a victim's perspective, they are interacting with a genuine, legitimate site, whereas in reality, every interaction is actually being monitored and manipulated by an operator. It's enabled by three main components. That's the reverse proxy that performs the site mirroring, automation that handles the data collection, and then the real-time operator, which is controlled via a web panel as well as Telegram. I think the final point is really worth emphasizing there is that there is a human operator involved here. It's not something that is happening automatically. They are active in the final stages of that session. But I think it's also worth giving it some sort of comparison to maybe a more traditional skimmer like MageCart, because it provides some useful context. So MageCart, which is injected into legitimate websites, which is compromises, and it conducts passive data collection. So it only gathers data at the stage of payment submission, compared to Katana, which occurs on completely attacker's infrastructure and it's active. So the operator is hands-on, controlling the entire session, and they are dictating what kind of data they are collecting from the victim. So unlike MageCard, which only goes for card data and some PII, Katana operators can go for card data, credentials, OTPs, as well as ID cards. They can decide it all based on the value of the card they assign from their own infrastructure. So in terms of outcomes, that's where there's another difference. MageCard, it leads to card theft. Katana, it can lead to a full identity and account compromise. So it shows that Katana represents a different kind of threat model than what we've seen previously in terms of these systems. We discover it. It's quite interesting because it was not identified through, say, targeted research. It actually surfaced through an investigation into some unrelated infrastructure. And this is one of those things that I find really interesting about infrastructure. You know, you can have that same IP address across its lifespan being used for and reused for various different functions. This is a case in point. The IP address that led us to Katana was previously identified in a Team PCP supply chain attack. We have no evidence to suggest that this is in any way related to Team PCP, but 3 days after that IOC was reported in that supply chain attack, this web panel appeared. So you can just see how quickly the IOCs can vary in terms of context and function if they appear in your logs and what it could be associated with. But back to Katana. On that IP, we identified a web page hosting with the name Katana Panel. It was a very nondescript login page. No one from the OSINT team could identify it on the dark web as a tool that was being sold. My own open source research couldn't even identify it. So it kind of prompted us to look into it a little bit further to see what it was and understand what we were dealing with. So pivoting around it, we actually identified initially 22 IP addresses that were hosting similar login panels, and they all had same infrastructure characteristics. So a shared certificate or a naming convention, hosting patterns, so the ports that were open and the response behavior, it was all identical. And by the end of May, so we've been tracking this, that IP cluster has grown to about 31. So it indicates that the infrastructure is being used and it hasn't turned dormant yet. The most significant finding, though, to us was actually the identification of an open directory on one of these IP addresses, which when we pivoted to, we identified the entire source code for Katana at our disposal, containing the likes of deployment scripts, operator documentation, as well as the attack logic. So in effect, the entire platform, despite us not having the login credentials to it, it was exposed. And so the analysis I'm going to walk you through is all based on that visibility. It's worth noting, though, that that Open Directory, it was closed at around the end of April, start of May. So the analysis of the code is reflective of how Katana operated at that point in time. Since the start of May, we can't really say if it's changed. However, based on the active infrastructure, it doesn't look like it has undergone significant change. Source code analysis, we got access to just shy of 150 directories and over 250 files. It was the complete file tree for Katana, including those documentations, deployment tooling, source codes, and any branding assets. So it was the entire kit left there that the attacker had essentially just uploaded, and it had everything from those to hard-coded credentials. It was everything we could need to recreate the entire full attack chain from both an attacker and a victim perspective, because the operator had included both of them in the attack chain or in the file tree itself. We also saw the file timestamps, and that was also interesting. I was looking at this infrastructure around the start of April, and you can see that the file timestamps were for the end of March. So it's indicative that this was recent or ongoing or an ongoing development. So all the modifications also in files clustered around the same time we saw the initial infrastructure being spin up. So this was something that the operator was actively working on. And then to call out one file in particular, we had a readme.md file at root, which was the full operator documentation. And it started to give us this idea that this could possibly be a platform that the operator wants to try sell, because there was so much detailed documentation there. It's not something you necessarily would just write if you were going to use it yourself. It would be something if you were looking to share it with others. And I also think what was interesting is that included a section, which I'll go into later, called To Another AI, which hints at the possible integration of this tool with AI tools. So initially the infrastructure shows specific targeting of North America as well, which was quite interesting. But from the files, we also realized that the intended scale and scope of this tool is a lot broader than that. So what we learned from the source code, just to walk you through the attack chain and the victim journey, is that the attacker first begins with a typo squatted domain. So they tend to spin them up with the same kind of naming pattern. So that's a.domain name, .ca, .tld, that's registered. And then they try to push those domains to the top of, say, users' search engines via the likes of malicious advertising, Google Ads traffics, for example. And then at this point, they have to wait for a user to click or interact with it. This is where they've used their first external tool, which is a traffic filter tool called Palladium. Palladium is a Ukrainian-based traffic filtering system, so you can determine what user agents or what sort of interactions you want with your web page. And the attacker deployed this so it would prevent the likes of web scanning from looking at the final page. So it would prevent it seeing that mirroring behavior, as well as security researchers like myself from being able to investigate it. Also at this stage, they disable the likes of dev tools on the website, so you can't do any analysis of it in real time. So they're trying to do everything to complicate it from an investigative standpoint, but often things, a common user is not going to be looking at if they click onto the website. So once the traffic has been filtered, so if you are just a unsuspecting user, you're passed on to what is considered or called the proxy site. So this is going to be a web page that is mirroring a legitimate merchant site. So for example, this could be a restaurant chain, it could be a retail store, for example. It's going to be sitting on their site, and in real time, they're pulling all the data, images, addresses, etc. But interesting enough, they disable Google Maps because that would prevent or present a conflict of location if you saw it in real time. So they've done everything to try and make it look as believable as possible. And they also, if it comes to a kind of a merchant site, they disable pay in cash as an option or pay by check. Or download the app. Because any of those functionalities would move you off their site to, again, legitimate infrastructure. So they've done everything to just remove those possibilities and hopefully steer the victim in the right direction. And also at this point, they're fingerprinting the browser. They're trying to get an image of what kind of victim they have interacting with their site. So once you create your order, you go to create your purchase and move to your checkout basket. It overlays a fake 3DS card site. So depending on the card details you put in, it's going to check it against a local file in the source code we found and determine what bank the card's associated with, what card type it is. Is it a Visa? Is it a MasterCard? What the region it's from is based. And this is in turn used to automatically generate the correct bank logo, the correct authentication page per bank, as well as bank-specific messaging, all of which is locally held on the attacker's panel. So they're just retrieving it in real time from these pre-existing files. Beyond that, it also then enables the operator to decide how they want to proceed with you as a victim. So at this point, the operator will have received a notification on Telegram that a new session has been set up and that they can interact with you, though you'll just see it as a potential bank pop-up. So they can decide whether or not they want to push an OTP code request and potentially steal that session. They might ask for another card if they think yours won't be valuable enough for them to forward on, or they can also request ID. So if they want to take the fraud payment to the next level and then do full identity compromise, they can very well do that. Also, they have a built-in specification to check for cards that aren't verified by Visa yet, and they're considered more valuable by the operator because those are less likely to trigger on strong authentication requests from banks. So they're doing as much as they can to analyze this data in real time while engaging with you. And I think it's important to emphasize again, this is not passive data collection. This is fully hands-on by the attacker via Telegram, and it's all to enable a full account takeover with a single session. And then, at this point, once you've checked out, no payment is made. We've seen evidence of users online who have navigated to these fake websites, submitting complaints against the legitimate websites, saying their orders never arrived. So we know payment isn't taken. But at this point, the attacker has all the data they need to stored on their panel. So the infrastructure that we looked at initially showed that this was very much scoped only to North America, primarily the United States and Canada, particularly the hospitality sector. But the code told an interesting story about how big or how ambitious the operator scope was in developing this tool. So it contained, files contained the names and the associated branding images of over 200 banks that were placed all around the globe, everywhere from North America, South America, across the 5 continents, as well as it being scoped to over 28 languages. So these were primarily European languages, but also included Chinese, as well as Latin American Spanish, other dialects. And so from that, we can only assess that the operator intends to scale this rather than being, a regionally specific tool. It's something that he or she is preloading so that none of the research has to be done by a purchasee. The system or the panel is already ready for an operator to just sign up and use it once they submit a website that they choose to deploy it on. So also I've included a screenshot. You can see kind of a list of the different countries being referenced. So you can see, cards associated with China, American Express, Cyprus. There very much is an intent for a global coverage. But I think what is most interesting is then if we look at, and I think it's also most timely, is, the evidence of AI-assisted development in Katana, because, it's something that people are often talking about now. We've seen other threat actors use AI in different ways, be it to code malware, to rewrite files, to evade detection and defenses. So how did this operator use AI? Well, we saw it in 2 primary ways. We saw it in being actively used to write the code. So in, say, the platform development of Katana, as well as the intention of integrating AI into the operating system itself of Katana at later stages. So the documentation, for example, many of the files, I've included screenshots there. You can see that the structure, for example, the V2, that's a convention that's really commonly associated with the likes of AI tools. When you ask it to recode the same sort of program again and again, it'll start labeling it as different versions. So in some instances, we saw version 2 for Katana, but in other scripts that were bundled together, we saw version 5 or version 7. So, you have this disparity, but it's most likely coming from the AI. We also saw, over-explanatory comments that aren't really consistent with how a human developer or programmer would write their comments, which again, we associate with the likes of AI involvement in how it was being generated. And then I guess the most damning kind of evidence that there was an intention for this tool to be used in conjunction with AI was there was a dedicated file section for another AI, which had wording structured for an AI ingestion, instructing it how to spin up the website, the Dockers, the systems needed, the entire panel without the need of the operator being involved with it at any stage. So what does this do on a practical level? Well, it reduces the technical skills required to operate Katana. So, gone are the days where you need to be proficient in how you code websites. The system comes with that. You can orchestrate everything across Telegram, across the page. And so this speeds up the development as well as the deployment of these platforms. There's no more dwell time, so to speak. And I guess most concerningly, this enables operators to scale campaigns a lot faster and almost simultaneously. The system's preloaded with the banks, with the regions, everything needed to do this globally. It's already there pre-existing. So there's very little that the operator needs to do except just input the domain, just buy the domains and have them ready so the AI can generate the HTML code for them. So in effect, it's just showing how much the adaptation of AI is becoming faster, more accessible, and at a lower cost, enabling the proliferation of kind of lower skilled or lower technically competent threat actors. And I think just to wrap it up, we can't really wrap it up without considering the so what of all of this, because in reality, this is a small cluster of IPs, it's just slightly over 30, the infrastructure is relatively small. We haven't yet seen it, marketed on the dark web, forums, or marketplaces, but it still gives us, a few lessons learned as well as indicators of what is to come in, in the months or as the threat landscape evolves. So one thing I think interesting to note is, session hijacking it's really displacing page-based phishing now as a primary mechanism for fraud as well as password or credential theft. This platform in particular, it enables complete control over the entire page, the entire session. The operator can relay those credentials and authentication factors in real time. As a result, detection strategies that are centered on looking for detections that, this user has navigated to a malicious domain or a well-known phishing page, they're going to become increasingly ineffective against these kind of attacks because you need to look at more behavioral indicators at a session level. So, the geolocation of these requests, are they inconsistent? Are we seeing a repeated retry patterns followed by, that successful authentication? All these things are things that we need to consider in moving towards how we counter these kind of threats. Then looking at fraud as a capability, it's changing from, something as a skill, someone could be skilled at this kind of thing, to it's being augmented into a platform. So you don't need to be skilled in fraud, lesser in the social engineering. You just need to be able to register a website and have that spun up, and Katana's going to do the rest of the work for you. So, and this speaks back to that whole point of enabling multiple campaigns across regions. It's going to be at a scale that may be somewhat more unprecedented, and it's going to pollute a lot of detections. It's going to increase the volume, the consistency of these attacks. And it highlights the need for organizations to be aware of their own brand abuse. So where is their name being misused? Where is it being typo squatted, for example? Or also, how is their legitimate infrastructure, their legitimate websites being connected to by other user agents? Is it being mirrored on other sites that, it might not be a domain that impersonates your website, but it might be still using your content. So these are things that you need to think about and consider. If you're not looking for them already, is there ways you can look for them? And then, of course, lastly, to speak on the previous slide, AI-assisted development, it really is compressing the build to deploy cycle that we're seeing. It's lowering that barrier to entry for building these platforms, for adapting these platforms as well. If this is a platform that's going to be sold, and the purchasee isn't happy with what it does, they can very much just help use an AI to change it. Because while this was very much focused, on card fraud, it very much could easily be manipulated to more credential theft. What Matt was speaking, the likes of shiny hunters, these are tools that can be manipulated as they become more increasingly available. So consequently as well, we'll see new versions adapt. So once the source code is out there, again, like Shai-Hulud, you'll see variants emerge. And because of those variants, it might only be a minor change, you'll start seeing that emerging defensive controls won't be enough for a specific variant. And they're going to need to it's going to be a bit of a game of cat and mouse as you try to capture that. So I think the takeaway, the lesson I learned, at least from Katana, was we need to look at how we can consider implementing controls that assume user compliance in these kind of systems. So what can you change in your detections if you assume that a user goes along with how the tool or how the operator wants them to? If they put in all that information and there's never a hit for a malicious domain, is that something you can still detect? I think, yeah, the through line across all three of these points is that Katana succeeds because the user does everything right, but so the controls need to work at exactly that reason. Katana removes, that element of opportunistic fraud as best as it can. It replaces it with something that's controlled. It's real-time exploitation at scale. And that's the little walkthrough through Katana.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Dylan, for that. I really appreciate you jumping on today. Hopefully it goes to show as well some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes in NCC's threat intel team as well, and some of the reports that we're pumping out. So the write-up for that is in our monthly report, which should be coming out to you any day now, but I think first thing tomorrow morning, in fact. So all the details are going to be in there for you. Next webinar is going to be Tuesday, 21st of July, usual time, 1600 BST. Hope you have a cracking time between now and then if you happen to be going on holiday or anything like that. As always, please feel free to drop us a line if there's any feedback, anything you'd like to see or anything you don't want to see anymore in these sessions, and we will adjust accordingly. So until then, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you next time. Thanks very much.